This is the second generation Eljer Patriot toilet, introduced all the way back in 1995, but was only made until 1999 when it would be replaced with the third generation, which is the front flusher variant. This generation brought over many aspects of the first generation, including the flush and mostly overall design. However, there is a major difference, and that is the trapway opening. It was completely redone from the ground up. So let's take a look at this toilet and see, is it any better than the first generation? The answer is no, but let's take a look at it. For clarification purposes, for this second generation, we're only covering the elongated versions, the standard height and the comfort height versions. The round versions are actually a lot different compared to other generations, which is very unusual. Same with the second generation Eljer Savoy when we eventually get to it. But without further ado, let's get started. The overall design looks pretty similar to most other Patriots, with the same exact tank that is shown here. It's very curvy. Trapway passages are more or less almost the same, except there are some slight differences, as you'll soon see with the opening. Here is the opening. You can see it's kind of like they call an orange slice opening now, compared to the older one, which was just the size of a golf ball. It was just a small circle. Meanwhile, this one has a slightly increased trapway and is a little bit more larger, but as you'll soon see, it doesn't really matter all that much. You can also see the siphon jet is more or less the same, except it looks a little bit more larger than the first generation. The tank parts are pretty standard, but they do work fairly well. The handle was replaced, obviously, and so was the flapper, although you probably couldn't tell that. But it has a ball cork fill valve, which fills up fairly fast. You can also see that plastic ring in the center there, which is supposed to reduce the water usage. How successful is that? Not so much, because a lot of these are mostly replaced, but this one has held up somehow. Not much else to say, but the parts work fairly well. Let's have a look at a flush. The standard height ones have a pretty interesting flush, although you can kind of tell it is a little bit weak, although it does offer a very satisfying swirl to it. So I do need to bring this up that the comfort height version does flush somewhat similarly, but much worse. The comfort height one has a much larger bowl and deeper bowl, might I add. For whatever reason, the first generation has the same problem, and so did later third and fourth generations of the Patriot and Savoy. I don't know why they did that. That was a really dumb design on Eljer, but that's not the only toilets they did that on. The comfort height one does not have a good flush at all. In fact, the siphons just kind of last longer, but it's still so weak that it doesn't really even matter. As you saw with the flush, you can notice already one problem with this toilet, and that is pulling factor. It sucks so bad. You can see how weak the siphon is, and the pulling factor is so weak, you probably noticed that this thing leaves a lot behind, constantly. And the comfort height versions are no different. Another thing that sucks about this toilet is the performance on both the standard and comfort height versions. It's no different. Now, considering that this is a new and improved version of the first generation, it's very similar to the first generation, you would expect it to perform a little bit better with this slightly larger trapway. No, it does not perform any better than the first generation. Sometimes I argue this thing performs worse than the first generation, and that sounds kind of crazy considering the first generation has the trapway opening the size of a golf ball. So how does this perform worse than the first generation? I really do not know, but this is no better than the first generation in terms of performance. Let's have a look at bowl rinse. As you can see, the front rim seems to have pretty fine rinse, but the back rim, as you'll kind of soon see, is kind of weak. Sure, the angled rim jets do help out a little bit, but by that much, not really. Let's take a look at that again. Yeah, it really isn't too great of ball runs, but the cover height ones have terrible ball runs, which is no shocking considering how deep the balls on those are. But standard height ones, they seem alright, although it could use a little bit of work. Here's another angle on the ball runs. And that is the second generation Eljer Patriot toilet. Is it really any better than the first generation? No, it has many of the same problems that it has. The pulling power sucks. The performance still isn't that good. It's kind of crap, honestly. And it just has a lot of the same problems that the first generation has, meaning that this new and improved version is not an improvement at all. It kind of sucks. But let's grade it. The overall design of the Patriot is more or less the same as the previous version and later versions, so I don't really have much to add here. It gets a 5. The original tank parts work pretty well. They're pretty standard overall with a standard ball cock fill valve and flapper. Very simplistic, but they work. The only thing that doesn't age well is the plastic ring around the flapper, because those things break. I mean, it is plastic after all, but honestly that doesn't really matter. The parts overall get a 7. The quality control can go either way. On the standard height version, it's pretty whatever. It works alright, but there's some aspects that could have been easily improved. While on the comfort height version, it's pretty crap, due to having very inconsistent rim jets and just the ball runs being outright terrible, as well as just the flush being a lot worse. It's definitely lacking on the comfort height version. For the lower end scale, it gets a 3, but on the higher end scale, at most, it's a 5. The trapway has the same exact problem as the first generation. While yes, the trapway opening is larger, it still is rather small and compact, therefore making it still pretty easy to clog one of these, as you'll kind of soon see. The trapway gets a 3. The flush on the standard height version is pretty meh. While the swirl is pretty satisfying, it just feels a little bit weak, and don't even get me started on the pulling factor. It's pathetic, but we'll get to that in just a second. On the comfort height version, it is definitely a lot worse. It flushes like crap, and it's because of the deeper ball. Nothing really more. On the lower end score, it gets a 3, while on the high end scale, it gets a 5. The pull on both versions suck. There's just no getting around it. Due to how weak the pull is and the siphon is just barely there, only being extended if it has a little bit of extra water, it's still pathetically weak and does nothing to get things pulled down. And you would not believe how many times this thing has left stuff behind. On both versions. It sucks. It gets a 2. The performance is complete crap. What a shock. Honestly, it really isn't much better than the previous generation, which by the way has the trapway opening the size of a golf ball. It is ridiculously small, yet this new version performs about the same, sometimes if not worse than the previous version, which sounds like complete bullcrap, but I'm not making that up. This thing performs like crap on both versions. It gets a 3. The ball really depends on what version you got. On standard height, it's pretty alright, although some areas could have been improved upon. The comfort height version is complete crap. No exceptions. The lower end scale gets a 3, while the higher end scale gets a 6. These things don't last for crap. In fact, a lot of these have been slowly getting replaced, and it's pretty obvious why. Because they suck. Both of these hold up terribly, despite some of the quality aspects being different. And both of them get a 2. Now let's talk about the overall value. For a new and improved version, there is nothing improved with this generation of Patriot. At all. It still more or less has the same problems as the first generation. It performs like crap, it holds up like crap, the pulling factor absolutely sucks, so on and so forth. You would think that they would try to improve some things with this, but all they did was just redesign the opening a little bit and called it a day. All the problems of the first generation are there, if not worse, than the previous generation. Which is absolutely pathetic, and it's no shock why these things are becoming so rare. Because they suck. On the lower end score, it gets a 2. On the higher end scale, it gets a 3. Now let's take a look at the final scores of the second generation Eljer Patriot toilet. On the lower end scale, aka the comfort height version, it gets a 33 out of 100, while the standard height version gets a 40 out of 100. Yeah, there's no question this thing's a piece of crap, but honestly, it's kind of wasted potential. They could have done so much more with this toilet besides just redesigning the trapway to be a little bit larger. Yet it's clear to me that they didn't really try with it. They just redesigned it and left it with all the problems of the first generation, if not worse.